And now I will formally introduce you to what's going on here tonight. Warwick's is very pleased to host Dan Werb as he discusses his new book, The Invisible Siege, The Rise of Coronaviruses and the Search for a Cure, in conversation with Davey Smith. Dan Werb, PhD, is an award-winning writer and epidemiologist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Salon, and elsewhere. He holds faculty appointments at the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Toronto. His book was named one of Publishers Weekly's top 10 science books of the season. In their starred review of the book, they said, "This page-turning and unsettling look at the history of coronaviruses is a unique and valuable addition to the expanding body of work on COVID-19. He will be joined in conversation by Davey Smith. Davey M. Smith, MD, MAS, is an infectious disease specialist and translational research virologist, and he has published over 300 scientific publications in these areas. He is head of the Division of Infectious Diseases and Global Public Health at UC San Diego. In 2010, Dr. Smith was named HIV Researcher of the Year by the HIV Medical Association, and he became the co-director and principal investigator of the San Diego Center for AIDS Research in 2016. Since the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 in 2019, Dr. Smith has been engaged in the international effort to find safe and effective treatments, and you'll hear more about that in the book and from Dan tonight. In particular, he is the international protocol co-chair for the Active-2 treatment study, which is part of the US government's response to COVID-19 to find effective therapies for people with early COVID-19. Before I leave the screen, I just want to tell you to please use the Facebook comments to submit any questions you have for these two gentlemen. And after their conversation, I'll come back onto screen and convey those questions as time allows. You'll also see the link to order the book there in the comments section. So without further ado, Warwick's welcomes Dan Werb in conversation with Davey Smith.
Amanda, thank you so much. And thanks for having me back. I loved launching my first book, City of Omens, at Warwick's, and I'm so happy to be back here for Invisible Siege. So I'm really pleased that Davey could join. Davey is featured in the book. And before we got into conversation, I thought that I would embarrass Davey a little bit and read the first, one of the first sections in which we meet Davey. So as Amanda described, Davey is this amazing kick-ass HIV scientist who's done decades of work in trying to advance the prevention and treatment of HIV. And it's that sort of those decades of virological research that poised him to become one of the key players in Operation Warp Speed, the US government's planned and program to accelerate cures and like vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. So just going to read a little bit of the book, and this introduces Davey and his first foray into COVID-19 research, which immediately gets complicated. Behind his amiable smile and affability, Davey Smith, who grew up on the outskirts of Chattanooga, Tennessee, carried a certain Southern Gothic sensibility upon which he relied to carry him through the failures and frustrations he encountered. A literature major turned physician turned infectious disease scientist, Smith spoke in equally rapturous tones about the works of Flannery O'Connor as he did the mechanics of DNA transcription. Like many of the clinician researchers of his generation who had devoted their careers to battling the HIV/AIDS pandemic, Smith had been touched by the traumas and failures of the global response to HIV. When asked by a reporter to expound upon the fact that COVID-19 had introduced new fractures into society, Smith became incensed. "Nothing about this is new," he shouted. "This is how it always happens." The people who were dying of COVID-19, he pointed out, were the same type of people who had been dying of AIDS and every other epidemic. Smith, early on in the pandemic, had a good sense of how the anxiety around COVID-19 might manifest. In January 2020, when the novel coronavirus was still essentially a Chinese domestic problem, he had sent a proposal to the US National Institutes of Health for a large-scale randomized clinical trial to test the effect of hydroxychloroquine on COVID-19 disease. Hydroxychloroquine occupied a sweet spot that made it, Smith figured, potentially attractive for physicians. It had been in use for almost a century. It had proven to be effective against lots of different conditions, including malaria and arthritis, and it was basically safe to use. The fact that the experiments that had been done on it were done using mouse cells in a petri dish was, Smith knew, irrelevant to how they would be interpreted amid the COVID-19 pandemic, when faint promises took on the power of miracle cures. Smith was as ignorant as anyone about whether hydroxychloroquine would stop SARS-CoV-2 from replicating, and he admitted to having no illusions about it being a panacea. Still, Smith knew that if there were even an indication that it might be curative, and if the drug were available, people would start using it. The evidence on hydroxychloroquine was pretty weak, but clinicians the world over, desperate to help their patients by any means necessary, were almost certainly going to start prescribing it because it was already so widely available. A high-quality trial of hydroxychloroquine was needed, Smith implored, before people took matters into their own hands. Smith's passionate entreaties to launch a trial failed to register. The National Institutes of Health just blew him off. Undeterred, he sent the same proposal to the US Department of Veterans Affairs, one of the country's major funders of virological research. For good measure, he also forwarded it in January to the NIH-funded AIDS Clinical Trials Group, perhaps the most august assemblage of virologists in the world, who had begun shifting their considerable resources from HIV to COVID-19. The response? Crickets, said Smith. By mid-March 2020, 3 months later, the widespread clinical despair about COVID-19 had caused a surge in doctors all across the world prescribing the drug for patients sick with COVID-19. The spike in hydroxychloroquine use then spurred a wave of small, methodologically suspect studies from China, Korea, the United States, and finally France. As those papers reported promising preliminary results, clinicians redoubled their efforts to use the drug, thereby completing a feedback loop that saw anecdotal evidence fuel clinical prescribing, which fed into even more poorly designed studies with dubious results, which then cemented hydroxychloroquine as a key therapeutic in the fight against COVID-19. It was exactly what Smith had predicted and feared would happen way back in January. And then the president stepped in. At a March press conference, President Trump, seemingly off the cuff, endorsed hydroxychloroquine, which most people had never heard of, as a game changer against SARS-CoV-2 and turned it into front page news. Overnight, everyone had an opinion about the drug, many of which had nothing to do with scientific evidence about coronaviruses and everything to do with their opinion of the man who had just become the drug's promoter-in-chief. Throughout the early months of the pandemic, scientific misinformation had been spreading as quickly as the virus. Trump's elevation of hydroxychloroquine tipped the scale, ratcheting up the reproductive ratio of false claims by magnitudes. The week following his March 19 press conference, more than 100,000 posts about hydroxychloroquine were shared on Facebook. Within 10 days, under pressure from the White House, the US Food and Drug Administration announced an emergency use authorization for the drug, and millions of doses were distributed to hospitals despite the complete absence of high-quality evidence. What do you have to lose? Trump retorted when questioned about the flimsy data a few days later. I'll say it again. What do you have to lose? Take it. Surveying the chaos, Davey Smith offered his objective diagnosis. The technical term, he said caustically, is a shit show. The worst part was that the disturbing convergence of political power and scientific ignorance could have been prevented with an early trial testing to see if there was any merit to the claims about the drug. But that ship had long sailed. After the president's remarks, though, others finally came to agree with Smith. After the initial January blow-off, the NIH-funded AIDS Clinical Trials Group came back to him, shaken, it seemed, by recent events, and desperate for Smith to start the study he had proposed 3 months earlier. Smith, who kept a folder of all the rejections he received as a teaching tool for his students, was typically sanguine at the news. The frustration is that we should have done it in January, he said, but denial is the first human defense mechanism. So I'll stop there, but I think it's a great intro into, Davey, your experience with hydroxychloroquine, which I want to ask you about a little bit later, but I know you have some questions for me first.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That was pretty good. I like hearing it in your voice. It gives me a little bit of palpitations recalling all that craziness at the time. So that was pretty good. So how did you tackle translating virology into something a non-expert would want to read about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a social epidemiologist. I focused on HIV. I focus on overdose, understanding it as an epidemic professionally, but I know nothing about, the structural mechanics of viruses or their structural biology, or I didn't before writing this book. And, I think that actually probably helped me. If I had been an expert in virology, it might have been a lot harder to write a general interest book. But the way that I did it, the book's research was essentially two major things. It was interviewing scientists, people like you, people who had been and people who had been studying coronaviruses for decades, and then digging into peer-reviewed studies. So right at the beginning, when I was interviewing all these scientists, I would interview them and I would probably catch about 40% of what they were talking about. And then I would, have my transcripts prepared, and then I would go back and I would just try to understand all these terms that they had used by digging into the peer-reviewed literature. And I would just basically go back and forth. Like, it was like going home with homework every time and working on literally like trying to translate from one language to the other. So yeah, I mean, that's basically, that was my basic approach to it.
I like that approach a lot. It was really nice to read and sort of very gripping. So you said you learned stuff. What do you think would be the major takeaway that you learned from the book? What would be the one, or I'll give you two things that you would say was really cool that you took away from all this work that you did in this book?
Yeah, I would say the main takeaway for me is how long the path back, the story of the vaccines and the treatments and our understanding of coronaviruses go. And what's remarkable, what I discovered, which I think is truly remarkable, is that there were people, scientists, people like, I'll say Ralph Barrick, who is probably the world's greatest coronavirus researcher and someone who I interviewed extensively for the book, who had somehow figured out a way to anticipate how to deal with a virus that would emerge in the future that we couldn't predict. And the work that he started doing and that others had done to start that prediction work goes back to like the 1980s, which is pretty remarkable. And I think it was, so he started studying, a very small group started studying coronaviruses in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a few more after SARS in the early 2000s, a few more after MERS, which was another coronavirus that emerged in Saudi Arabia in 2012. And then at that point, there was the sense like, okay, there have been two coronavirus pathogens that have emerged basically, in virological time, like in the same instant. So we need to start preparing for the next one. And it was a tiny group of people who started that preparation, but that preparation really advanced things so far. The other thing that I'll sort of like the caveat on that is that the way in which scientific advancements are produced, the whole system by which they're produced, unfortunately, what I discovered is that system also works to reduce the access that the global South generally and lower income countries have to these cures. And that's something that I think is going to, prolong the pandemic and make it a lot harder for the world to move on. Now, Davey, I have a few questions for you. So I just described, the early moments when you were so prescient also, like in January when no one was thinking about hydroxychloroquine, when no one was thinking even really pandemic, they were thinking, oh, this is a Chinese domestic problem that they'll figure out, just like SARS. You were already anticipating that people are going to start using hydroxychloroquine. And I wonder if, you could not have known, I imagine, that it would get to the point where the president of the United States was calling for its use based on zero evidence or very, very dubious evidence. But I guess the question I have for you, so this isn't to spoil the book or anything, but you do end up launching a trial of hydroxychloroquine. And a lot of the work that you did with Operation Warp Speed had this kind of political dynamic, and we've seen that with lots of other scientists as well. So my question is, is that the norm? Is this political? Is meddling by politicians and political leaders the norm with scientific discovery, or is it an exception when that just happens to be something we're living through now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I thought about this a lot. There's two parts to it. Science has politics just like anything else, but that's just scientists having politics. It was never politicians having politics about science. There's been some good examples. You're an HIV epidemiologist. There was a lot of weaponization of science around, I think, like needle exchange. People just were up in arms. The science said one thing, but it didn't fit the narrative for politicians, so they wanted to say something else. But that's like orders of magnitude lower than the craziness around hydroxychloroquine. And even now, we talk about ivermectin and we talk about vaccines, and it really has, you can look at red states and blue states, and what people believe or don't believe is really drawn in those things that were never before. I talked to my mom recently, and she's like, we all lined up to get polio vaccines, and there wasn't nobody ever talked about that. That was just what we all did, because that was the science, and people trusted scientists. And I think that one big thing with that is, one thing that I learned is that I need to as a scientist, do a better job at talking to people like you and people who can sort of translate, which is the reason for my question earlier, is like, I need to translate and be able to speak the truth to what the science means and what it doesn't mean, and why we do things and why we don't do things, to build trust back in the scientific process. And hopefully we bring the politicians along. I just think that there's just a lot of polarization right now that, and science is just another weapon in the setting of a pandemic that's used to hit the other side. Whichever side you're on, they just use it to hit the other one. So it just becomes problematic.
Yeah, so one person that I talked to quite a bit for the book is Ian Lipkin, who most people will maybe vaguely know as the scientific advisor on contagion. He's also, an incredible infectious disease clinician scientist. And talking to him, he went to China during SARS and delivered these PCR tests, something that is covered in the book, and has spent decades kind of working the back rooms of government kind of tables. And speaking to him, it was clear that he considers governments and politicians as kind of components of epidemics in a way, right? There's something that you if you're not dealing with the politicians, if your epidemic prevention strategy or pandemic prevention strategy doesn't take into account the craziness that politicians or sort of like the political decision making that's going to happen, then he basically would say that you're not doing your job. I wonder if that resonates with you, and if you think that's the job of scientists to tackle.
I think it is the job of scientists to at least think about these things and how it can be used. I often use the terms of sort of weaponization of science to attack the other side. It's not about the truth. It wasn't about how to save lives. It was really how do I make my side get a few more points than the other side? I kept seeing that. And one thing, I sort of shied away a lot from the big interviews, because if you were on a particular big national cable channel, whatever, boy, it was all of a sudden, oh, he's a conservative guy. He must believe in ivermectin. Oh, he loves hydroxychloroquine, or he hates it, and that's because he's the president. And it wasn't about truth at all. It was about whatever your politics were at the time, and it just got icky, because I wanted to go out there and talk about, and I do locally, is to talk about on the news. I'm like, okay, this is what it means. It's my job to sort of translate. What is a mask mandate? What can it do? What can it not do? Why do we need to get a vaccine? What the heck is a booster? Those are really important questions that people want to know. And I think that's my job as an ID doc and a researcher as well. But it's just viewed through the political lens just makes it hard. I was walking my dog one day, and one of my neighbors was really mad at me because I had been on the news telling people to get their vaccine, and I was just walking my dog, and he was walking his dog, and it was just one of those surreal moments that I'll never forget.
How did you extricate yourself, or did you extricate yourself? Like, did you engage, or?
I did. I was just a little dumbfounded. He's like, vaccines kill people. That COVID vaccine kills people. You need to stop saying that on the news. And I was just sort of struck silent, and he walked away. And but it was it was just one of the weirdest things ever.
Yeah, wow, that is it's shocking when your work spills into the rest of your life, I guess.
When you walk in your dog, yeah.
One other question I had for you. So, another takeaway from the book for me in doing this work, and it's more of a, like, for those who read the book, it's more kind of like in the background. It's not the story of the book, but I find it so interesting how much of the HIV response shaped our response to COVID. And you're an HIV scientist. You went from one of the key HIV scientists to one of the key Operation Warp Speed scientists, leading this massive international trial that tests different COVID-19 therapies, and from what I understand from you, will almost likely never end, because you're just going to be testing these drugs for the rest of your lives, or for the rest of your life. But I'm curious whether you can reflect a bit on, like, what elements of the response to HIV were, like, shaped our response to COVID-19.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I've said this a few times. We basically just followed the HIV playbook, but in a condensed version, because it took decades to get that playbook from HIV really sort of figured out. Things that we learned, like people who are the most vulnerable in your community, who don't have health insurance, the poorest among us, the most vulnerable, those are the ones that the epidemic likes to pick off first. And that's exactly what happened with COVID. So you got to protect them. You got to educate. You got to make procedures. You got to make structural changes in place to protect them the most. We just remember the nursing homes got hit like everybody died in those nursing homes. And that was just a classic. Those are the most vulnerable in our community. Those need to be protected the most. So it was very telling when I looked around Operation Warp Speed tables, and even today in the U.S. government response to COVID, there are all these HIV researchers, and we're just playing that book. This is how a pandemic kills people, and how do we prevent it? This is how you make therapies, and this is how you test them. And all the science is there as well. It's all built on mRNA vaccines. Were looked at in HIV, and other vaccines were definitely within the HIV realm. and it didn't work for HIV, but the science was there and it was able to be pivoted across. And the same thing goes now for a lot of the small molecules that are currently available, that are being used for COVID. But the big one that everybody talks about are these monoclonal antibodies, which is what my trial was all about at the beginning after hydroxychloroquine. All that technology was taken right off the shelf from HIV. That is what people were working on at the NIH and at Scripps and a whole bunch of other places, and it really has saved a whole bunch of lives at the very beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, and so I want to remind people, if you have questions, I think we just have maybe one or two more questions on our side, and really encourage people to submit questions in the chat. Yeah, Davey, what I find so interesting also looking at the history here, and so, this book basically chronicles the trajectories of, a handful of scientists working over the past few decades on issues that kind of converge into COVID-19. And one of the fascinating things, and I know that you're interested in this too, is how failure shapes the response, right? And so that's why I think HIV is so interesting, because like the discourse around HIV and vaccination in particular is like, oh, well, we failed, like it's a failure. But then when you look at what actually happened, is that the failure to create an HIV vaccine just actually moved vaccination forward in ways that it hadn't ever before. Like, I talked to Barney Graham, who is the deputy director of the Vaccine Research Center at the NIH under Anthony Fauci. He said, he had run one of the first HIV trials in the 1980s, which was a colossal failure. He was like, we didn't know how vaccines worked before HIV. Like, we didn't need to know.
Yeah.
We knew that if we created antibodies, that they would protect people, but there was no understanding of how any of those mechanics worked. And it was only when the vaccines stopped working with HIV that this whole field of immunology to like actually understand the complexities of how the human body protects itself advanced enough that we could create these incredible cures. Anyway, I find stories where, and I know, as I mentioned in this passage, like you have this folder of failures, which is so wonderful, and I see something similar there, right?
Oh yeah, I think resilience is important in science, and that's the reason that I catalog all the grants that I didn't get, all the papers that I didn't get, so my trainees sort of can say, hey, you can still get there. It's just you have to go through some failure, and that's part of the process. But for the HIV vaccine, I remember that quote from the Health and Human Secretary, who said, "You will have a vaccine in a year," and then 4 decades later, no vaccine.
But
and
that was 1982.
Yeah, 82. Yeah, there you go. And it was. But that failure said, okay, now we need to really know why we failed, right? So that's basically how we greatly improved our vaccination technology. So I have another question. I think we're close to getting time for other questions, and I think it's great to hear from our audience. But what do you think is the fastest way, now that you've done all this work, because another pandemic is coming. Let me just be honest. We saw HIV, Ebola as a ID doc. This is a virologist, right? HIV, Ebola, Zika, West Nile, SARS senior, and then MERS, and now we have SARS-CoV-2 junior, and another one's coming. It's probably going to, I think the one that's overdue is another pandemic flu. So there was the swine flu, but there's the avian flu that's probably coming. So how do we stop it, or how do we get out of the next one?
It's a great question. I am someone who honestly is filled with so much hope and optimism. And I have to say, I'm at my own book launch, so I am going to shamelessly plug this book, which is behind me and here. It is a book of optimism, and I think it's really well-placed optimism. So first of all, the bad news, as you say, it seems like there's all these new viruses that are emerging, and that's true. Like there are more novel pathogens that have emerged that can, that have pandemic potential among humans. There are more that have emerged in the first 20 years of the 21st century than across the entire 20th century. So we're seeing an acceleration of these new pathogens, and they're for predictable reasons. They're because of the ways that humanity has encroached and has manipulated human or animal populations. And the more contact that humans have with animals and exotic animals, and placing animals in close quarters, and basically creating the perfect conditions for the spread of pathogens, that is what's going to cause new pathogens to emerge, to jump from the species. It's not like suddenly nature has decided to create a bunch of new viruses. It's that we're in closer contact, right, with natural habitats and animals that harbor them. However, we have an opportunity here, I think, because of the amazing prescient work that was done to respond proactively to a new coronavirus pandemic, for example, to get ahead of whatever comes next. So I think, first of all, I'll talk about the legacy of HIV in terms of like antiretroviral treatments, right? And this idea of treatment as prevention. So, there's no HIV vaccine that works. And in the wake of the failure of an HIV vaccine, incredible antivirals, which are called antiretrovirals because HIV is a retrovirus, were developed that can fully suppress the replication of the virus in your own system. And the amazing upshot of that is that they're so effective that they reduce the amount of viral load in someone's blood to essentially undetectable levels. And when there's such a small amount of virus in a person's blood, it's essentially impossible for them to transmit that virus to somebody else. And that's been proven just a scientific fact with HIV. So I mentioned Ralph Baric, and I mentioned this idea of trying to prevent future pandemics without knowing which virus might possibly emerge. Well, what Ralph Baric did, which is brilliant, is recognize that there are parts of coronaviruses that are the same no matter which coronavirus it is. The coronavirus family has a ton of different strains, hundreds, and specific viruses, like we've learned with like SARS-CoV-2, can have many, many variants. But there are parts of the virus that do not mutate or do not mutate frequently. And if you target those areas with antiviral treatments, it can prevent the replication of that virus. So that's what Ralph Baric was trying to do before COVID-19. He was trying to identify antiviral treatments that would work against every known coronavirus, knowing as he did that all known coronaviruses had these similar parts on their genome that would be susceptible. So if you could take down one strain with this antiviral treatment, you could take down all of them. And we now have a bunch of those antiviral treatments in hand. And so we can actually start moving not only to, in the current pandemic, we can start moving towards preventing people from getting really ill. But also there's evidence that they work when they're taken prophylactically. So like if you and I, Davey, are hanging out and I get infected with SARS-CoV-2, you could take one of these antiviral treatments, and that will protect you to a certain extent from getting infected. Like it's the same basic calculus as treatment as prevention. And the amazing thing about it is whatever coronavirus happens to emerge next will also certainly be susceptible in the way that all of the other coronaviruses have. So instead of, a cluster of pneumonias in Wuhan suddenly metastasizing into an epidemic, metastasizing into a pandemic, you can just make sure that you get these antiviral treatments that are now, on the shelf to everybody who is infected, and you can snuff out an epidemic before it even starts. So that's number one. The second is, I think, just more broadly, there's a lot of work that's being done, and Davey, your Prepare Institute at UC San Diego is among them. That's looking really, starting to understand that, you know, the market forces that only work to creating drugs that for conditions that already exist, that's like a collective action problem, right? Where everyone knows, as you said, that there's going to be more pathogens that emerge, and nobody's doing anything about it because of the way that the market works, because it's only profitable to create drugs for, you know, pathogens or conditions that already exist. But that is starting to shift, and there's some really, really interesting initiatives like Prepare, like Ready out of University of North Carolina, that are looking to create these broad-based treatments that can be effective against multiple families of viruses instead of just like one existing virus. And by doing so, anticipate, you know, a potential, the next potential pandemic. And maybe the last thing I'll say, so I mentioned Barney Graham, this guy who was the deputy director of the Vaccine Research Center, had lots to do with creating the Moderna, or developing the Moderna vaccine, and ran one of these first HIV trials. When I was chatting with him for the book, he said, okay, so we know that there's 26 viral families that can infect humans. All we need to do is create 26 vaccines, one for one representative of each of those families, and we'll essentially be able to protect ourselves from a future pandemic. He also said he had looked in, you know, last summer, there were 260 research groups in the world working on a COVID-19 vaccine. He thought, like, that's insane. It's insane. There's still this collective action problem, right? Where it's more somehow profitable, more rational in the system for 260 groups to be working on a COVID-19 vaccine, despite the fact that there's a bunch that are already effective, than for all of those groups to be split up and to work on one of these 26 viral families. Anyway, so maybe I'll leave it there. It's the optimism and the golden handcuffs of the free market, maybe, and we'll see who wins.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add on there is that there's 26 families. We just make monoclonal antibodies for each of them, put it on the shelf. When there's an outbreak, you just go in there and dose people. The real telling thing is that we will be successful when we don't have a pandemic. The problem is that in a market force that doesn't help company.
Yeah, it's the story not told.
Yeah,
always hard.
I really enjoyed talking to you, Dan. We should do this more often.
Yeah.
But now we have other questions I think we can take.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. Thank you. I'm going to bring in some questions from our Facebook viewers. So kind of along the lines of what you were just talking about virus families. Mike McCabe asked, when was the first coronavirus discovered and how many variants of it have been identified to date?
So the first coronaviruses were discovered in the late 1950s, I believe, and there were two that were identified. So they were these two human pathogens that could cause the common cold, and there were also a number of other animal coronaviruses that were identified. So one, there's actually, it's all over this book, but mouse hepatitis virus is a very useful coronavirus that's used in laboratories around the world. But, you know, basically from the 1960s until the emergence of SARS in 2002, there were only two known human coronavirus pathogens, and both caused really mild common cold symptoms. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why so little work had been done on coronaviruses up until then, because it just, you know, the assumption was that this is not a family that really infects humans, and when it does, it causes very, very minor conditions. What's really interesting is that in the wake of SARS, lots of researchers started undertaking, well, first of all, in the wake of SARS, a number of other coronaviruses were discovered that infected humans. So now we've got seven, there we go, seven human coronaviruses, including SARS, SARS-CoV-2, MERS, and then 4 that cause common colds. And there's this incredible, and I describe it in the book, this technique called molecular clock analysis that scientists started using to basically spool the thread back in time to see when new virus strains emerged. So basically, the point at which a viral strain mutated so far from its most closely related virus that it became a new strain. And when you sort of use molecular clock analysis to turn back the clock, it's evident that there was a coronavirus, a human coronavirus pathogen that emerged in 1889, 1890, right around when this pandemic called the Russian flu was basically spread across the world. And it's increasingly suspected that that was a coronavirus pandemic that we fully missed. That's described in the book. And then another molecular clock analysis was done suggesting that this other very, very benign common coronavirus actually emerged like maybe in the 11th century. And at the time when when new pathogens emerge and jump species, generally they're associated with much more severe conditions than after they sort of come into stasis with their hosts. So I get into it in the book a little bit about the transition of pathogens from really, really intensely disruptive to more kind of benign, and what that might have meant for populations at the time. Sort of answers your question, Mike, but hope that's good enough.
But not enough to prevent you from picking up.
Yes.
Another question we had from Kevin Hedges. Did you, I assume for both of you, did you follow the evolution about recognizing and acknowledging aerosol transmission of the coronavirus, COVID?
I'll pass this one to Davey.
Yeah, no, it's a hot topic around masks, not masks, and aerosolization and not aerosolized. And honestly, that was a big one for politics too. Where you landed on the politic realm was for also hit close to home for masks. So did they have a question? Other than, did we follow it?
I think maybe they just wanted to hear you sound off a little bit on that.
Yeah. And honestly, it's changed because with the different variants, actually, is probably a different aerosolization process and infectious process all along. So really keeping those close to the science has really been important to figure out what mask to use, when to use it, and how it's effective or not.
Another question from John Jolly, a question for Davey as well. Do you have any feelings on the various recent changes in mandates and regulations being made at state and federal levels to transition from a pandemic response to an endemic response?
Yeah, I have lots of opinions on it. I think overall that the public health is from the state to the national levels doing a pretty good job. They're following the science. I don't think they're getting it perfectly right each time, but I think that we should expect those mandates and those advisory things that they send out to change. And that's okay. That's just how science works. When we see an uptick that happens in the summer, which it probably will, I imagine that we're going to have other mandates to try to tamp it down. And that's what I want my public health agency to do. People complain like, oh, they're changing their mind. Not changing their mind. They're just trying to follow whatever the epidemiology is there and whatever new science occurs. And we hope that they continue to do so. So that's my soapbox on that.
And I would add to that, we we always want government to act nimbly and flexibly. Like this is always something that government's getting harangued about because they don't move fast enough. But this is exactly what you're saying, Davey, right? Like it can be a bit like whiplash when government is reacting to the data, but that's what we want, right? We every stage of this epidemic every stage of this pandemic has been dealing with a different virus, right? Like the wild type virus that first emerged is so different than Omicron. In terms of how it, its impacts, how it moves through populations, how virulent it is. It's like you got to invent it all from the beginning over again.
I say this all the time. There have been 3 pandemics in one, and it's very clear on the drug development side, which I'm in, but also on the transmission side, the vaccine side even. There was the alpha beta in the original ones. Then there was Delta, which was horrible. I do not want to do that again. And now there's Omicron, which is bad because it's so darn infectious, but at least it has less pathogenesis. But yeah, 3 all at once. It's been nuts.
Kevin added a clarifying part to his question about aerosol transmission. Do you believe that there was too much of a delay in acknowledging aerosol transmission? And if we had acknowledged this earlier, could more lives have been saved?
I don't know. I think that the science was pretty good early on, but the adoption of it was based on the adoption in the hospital was fine. So when we talked about aerosolization, that was a big thing, is like, how do we keep our frontline staff safe? And the masks that they were using in terms of the N95 were always ended up working really darn well. It was what was the masks that were out being used in the community and what that actually meant and all those guidelines. And I don't want to fault them too much because hindsight is always 2020. Yeah, so that's probably what with that.
I mean, I'll add to that. The only real evidence that existed on how to stop coronaviruses came from SARS. And in the SARS epidemic in 2002, it spread through hospitals, but really didn't spread through communities out in the world too much. And it was stopped without vaccines, without treatments. It was really just like masking and PPE. So I think to your point, Davey, like it's not surprising that aspect of the response to SARS-2 was so much better defined than the rest of it, because that was the part that we knew at least would work for or had worked against coronaviruses in the past.
Yeah.
From Bruce Walsh, Dan, when the pandemic started, you were also optimistic as you thought that scientists would share information around the world to figure out a vaccination and treatments. Did this happen, or was the money the driving force that brought us to now?
It's a great question. So, you know what, one of the main things that happened, which I found really remarkable, is that basically so many aspects that hindered the spread or the production of research and the sharing of research were completely removed right at the beginning. So, as scientists, you go through the cycle where you write a grant, then you wait, 6 to 8 months to hear whether it's been, scored, and then you wait a little bit longer to hear, how you're going to get the money if it was, funded, and then you publish papers, and those papers are only made available to other scientists. Like that was all taken out. Funders, like the government, it was like, let's just open the fire hose, and there's funding for pretty much every halfway decent idea that can help us move the pandemic response forward. That was good and it was bad. As part of this research, I went through a database of studies that were registered as clinical trials, and it was like the effect of a short walk on COVID-19, the effect of like playing Frisbee on COVID-19, it was that ridiculous. So, there was, I think, a lot of opportunism and it led to some bad science, and people had to sift through the good science and the bad science in real time. And we all know how that went. Like, it wasn't a perfect process, as Davey can attest to. And then on the other side, like, peer-reviewed studies, which were behind a paywall, basically, suddenly were made available to absolutely everyone. And I think that was amazing, right? Because I think it allowed people who were engaged to start understanding how the science was being created, and share it with other people and interpret it and follow it. But it also led to people making crazy claims, like, someone would read a paper that talking about furin cleavage sites on a coronavirus, not having any idea what that meant, and then that becoming the basis for the idea that this was like a bioweapon created by the Chinese government. So I think that, yeah, overall there were some really, really positive, like, evidence was created really, really quickly, which was cool. A lot of it was shared, or I mean, all of it was basically shared, which was also cool. But did it radically reorient the way that market forces direct the drug discovery and scientific discovery? And did it lead to better access to the fruits of scientific discovery? No, it didn't. And you look at low-income countries, there's something like 12% of people in lower income countries have had one vaccine dose. That's bad, obviously, for them, but it's bad for us in wealthy countries, because variants are going to emerge in places where people have not reached herd immunity through vaccination or through natural infection. And those variants are going to weaken the vaccines that we just took. So this is a weird situation where actually and I've repeated this a number of times, where the most selfish approach is actually also the most ethically sound approach, where we're making sure that the world is vaccinated is the number one thing you can do to end the pandemic for you. And the fact that it's, the Lancet had a cover story, and it basically said, wealthy countries acted worse than anyone could ever imagine. That was like the quote on the front, talking about vaccine distribution. Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunately come to pass, but hopefully that will change.
We're coming to the end of our time here, but we have a couple more questions that are short but really big, and maybe we can try to lightning round it. So Tony Mendoza asks Dr. Smith, is AIDS and HIV research being put on the back burner because of COVID research?
Yeah, so during the setting of the COVID pandemic, HIV research in many places, including ourselves, we had to pivot for a little bit. However, the good news is that it's back in full force, and yeah, super excited about keeping HIV. It's still a pandemic. It still kills thousands of people a day, and we think that we forget about it, but it's still there and still a thing. So.
And I'll add, I spoke with some people, HIV scientists working on HIV vaccines. So oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name. But anyway, really smart guy who is an HIV vaccinologist. And his take was, look, we've all focused on COVID-19, but the advances in vaccinology have probably moved an HIV vaccine forward 10 years. And that's really exciting, because, just like HIV's initial failure, the HIV vaccine's initial failure seeded the success of COVID-19 vaccines. That is now, I think, going to go back and support HIV vaccinology, which is cool.
All right. Huge, short question. Michael W. Young asks, are we ready for the next epidemic? What is the most important change we need to make?
My thought is that big things that we've talked about before, we're not fully ready. We should have vaccines and therapies on the shelf, but at least we have playbook now for a respiratory type pandemic to occur. And I think hopefully people will be ready to tackle that when it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would concur there. I think the biggest change, aside from the advancement of the science, is people understand what is needed. And also, I think people understand the gravity, right? The risks and how important it is to prevent the next one. And so, I mean, all I would say is, I think from a population perspective, everybody knows those risks and understands what's needed. And then on the scientific side, I think there are huge advancements that are going to serve us extremely well as we move forward.
Thank you. And last thing I'll ask both of you, are you on social media? Are you active there? Where can people follow both of you if they'd like to follow your adventures in this land?
Yeah, I'm mostly on Twitter in terms of social media, and I'm at DM Werb. Come find me.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, TikTok, not as much Twitter, but TikTok and some Twitter. Davey M. Smith, MD. So you can come and check me out.
Cool.
Davey, you're making me feel old.
I thought you were messing with me, but you're actually on TikTok.
Yeah,
That's
so
great.
both of those at Davey M. Smith, MD. You can come hear my TikTok videos about vaccines and stuff. So
Cool.
yeah.
Amazing.
Fantastic.
It's mostly just me and my niece, but yeah, come hang out.
Aw. Thank you both so much. Incredible talk. I'm going to close down the Zoom, but everyone remember to please find this at your favorite independent bookseller. And it's urgent and important and also elegant and fun to read, oddly enough, I would say. So don't be, of course we can be alarmed, but don't feel put off by the seriousness of the subject matter. It's so important. And so thank you all. And also, if you want to rewatch this, it'll be available on YouTube. So you can find it there. And with that, I'll say good night and thank you, both of you.
Thanks to you both, and thanks everybody for tuning in and being here.
Good night.
Thanks.
Bye.